Usually when a game's been called one of the worst video games ever, there's no real reason to actually play it. Why would you play Big Rigs, or Ride to Hell, or Squidge or Supergran, or any of the various microcomputer abominations I've featured on my channel over the years? Normally the only reason people do have is a morbid curiosity. Let's say you watch a video by the AVGN, and you're curious to see if the game he's covered is as bad as good old James says it is. 99 times out of 100 it will indeed be as bad as he says it is. But there's the odd game out there that might warrant a little bit more inspection than that. While there are many pearls in the video game world, games that are rightly successes and have inspired plenty of others, it's much rarer to find a total failure of a game that has also inspired people. Quite a lot of people, as it happens. Today we're covering one such computer game. When Jurassic Park Trespasser came out in 1998, people hated it. Most of them couldn't even play it, and the scant few that could to any reasonable level didn't like what they saw. Many magazines and sites of the time said it was by far the worst game of the year, some reviewers even calling it the worst game they'd ever played. The people who made the game don't usually mince words, and they'll agree that the game was, in the end, a failure. When it came out it was thoroughly unfinished. Sales-wise it was a complete bomb, shipping pitiful numbers for the money it cost to make. However, it was ambitious. It was trying to do so many things that no other game had done to that point, and in doing so, it managed to drive PC gaming forward, inspiring others to take what Trespasser attempted to do and do it right. And it spawned a highly dedicated community that have not just tried to preserve the game over the 20 plus years since its release, they've enhanced it, made it so that it's easy for people to not just play the game, but play it in such a way that's a little closer to what the game's creators originally intended. Very few failures have managed to stand the test of time in the way that Trespasser has, to the point where it actually might be one of gaming's most influential complete failures. So now it's time to go back and tell this game's quite fascinating story, from the utterly fraught development to the disastrous release, and eventually to the game's somewhat unique standing today. This is the story of Jurassic Park Trespasser. How are we going to do this then? Well, naturally we'll start by talking about the game's origins, the story behind its creators and what they wanted to do. We'll dive into the game's development, discussing the finer details of its creation and how, in the end, it all went wrong. We'll see how bad the reactions to the game were and experience it in a way that's close to how people experienced it in 1998. We'll find out how, despite all of this, the game went on to have an influence on several other very important games, and we'll look at the community that has kept the game going for all these years. Finally, using what these people have done, we'll be able to take a second look at Trespasser as a game, rather than as an examination of all its technical faults, and be able to see just what the game's developers were trying to do and how successful they actually were. There's a lot to get through, in other words, so let's not waste any more time. How does a game go wrong? Oftentimes a couple of boilerplate reasons may be chucked out there. The management interfered too much, the organisation wasn't there, the ambition of the team and leaders wasn't matched by their skills and implementation. Usually there's a lot more to the story than that, and certainly in the case of Trespasser, to say that the team behind it was lacking in skill would be totally off the mark. The Trespasser team was a murderer's row of incredibly talented coders, artists and designers, most of whom had a lot of experience already when it came to pushing the boundaries of PC gaming. A lot of them had previously worked at Looking Glass Studios. They'd been at the head of Ultima Underworld 1 and 2, the original System Shock, and Flight Unlimited. Indeed, if you were to try and put together a dream team of 90s PC developers to work on Trespasser, it probably wouldn't be too far away from the team who actually did work on Trespasser. At the head of this team is a man you probably know already, a physics graduate and exceptional coder in his mid-20s named Jonathan Blackley, better known as Seamus Blackley. Blackley's greatest achievement at Looking Glass was his work on creating the physics engine for Flight Unlimited, which at the time was considered more than a match for Microsoft's flight simulator. There were things you could do, such as acrobatics and the like, which you just couldn't do in Microsoft's more famous game at the time. Blackley wanted to take his work on Flight Unlimited further and use the game to create a flight simulator that was based around air combat. But the success of the title saw new management come in, and the new management's idea was to, basically make the game a lot more like Microsoft Flight Simulator. Blackley didn't agree with this, and so he was fired from Looking Glass in 1995. In the end, a large chunk of his colleagues would join him in his next position at a new game studio named DreamWorks Interactive. DreamWorks Interactive was the nascent video game division of the film production company started by Steven Spielberg, Jeffrey Katzenberg and David Geffen, and it started out in 1995 as a joint venture with Microsoft. Their first games occasionally won critical praise, but were usually limited when it came to commercial success, with their biggest hits being either more edutainment or simulation-based titles like Steven Spielberg Director's Chair, or licensed games based on the Goosebumps franchise. These days people would probably point to Doug TenNapel's adventure game The Neverhood as their best early title, but the rave reviews the game earned didn't translate to big sales. A part of DreamWorks Interactive's MO was, of course, vertical integration, to make it easier to take the films that the main studio was making and create a damn good computer game out of them. That would have certainly appealed to Steven Spielberg, who was himself an avid gamer and someone who wished to be, at least as much as he was able to, hands-on with the creation of DWI's games, certainly if they were games based on his movies. In an ideal world, DWI would have done away with the approach that movie studios had taken to licensed games in the past, treating them as just another piece of merchandise that wasn't worth paying an awful lot of attention to. Initially for Blackley and his main cohort, lead designer Austin Grossman, the idea of creating a game based on Jurassic Park or any other licensed product didn't occur to them. They would have preferred to do something original. At around about this time, in 1996 or so, games like Doom ruled the FPS world, and the release of Quake in June would see that sort of gameplay come to life in full 3D. But the sort of gameplay that Quake offered didn't appeal too much to Blackley and Grossman. What they wanted was to create a 3D game in a world that was more immersive, more open, more emergent. Something where you would have a goal, of course, but it wouldn't stick you on a linear path towards that goal or in a maze of corridors. Instead, it would be something that would leave you to your own devices, where events may just happen around you, something you could get lost in. That was the concept they were working towards, and now it was a matter of finding a game design to tie that to. And DWI held the key. They'd allow Blackley and Grossman to work on such a game, as long as they based it around Jurassic Park. More than that, the team would have essentially as much money as they needed to do the game, and they'd have creative control. Too good a deal to pass up, really. And so that's how Blackley, Grossman and company ended up making a Jurassic Park game. The obvious tie-in would be to The Lost World, of course. The sequel to Jurassic Park was coming to cinemas in May of 1997, and considering that it's the sequel to what was then the highest grossing film ever made, it was kind of a big deal. But making a more direct tie-in game to The Lost World that followed the events of the movie wasn't ever a big part of the equation. DreamWorks Interactive were already taking care of that with other more action-based titles on consoles, not to mention the arcade game from Sega. And by the time Blackley and Grossman had signed up to do this game with DreamWorks, it's not like they'd have had enough time to create such a game that would have been finished by the time the film was released anyway, even without all the brand new high-concept stuff they wished to include. And so the idea was to create more of a video game sequel to the Lost World movie, set in the environment of Site B and Isla Sorna, that ideally would be out sometime in 1998. They got a team together, and work began on making the game in earnest. So let's try and get into the details of the game's creation. What exactly were Seamus and company trying to make with Trespasser? The best thing to do perhaps is to take the claims that were made about what the game was going to be and lay them out immediately, as that'll help make more sense of the game's development. In short, they wanted to make a thoroughly immersive experience for the player that would largely be set in an outside world, as opposed to the corridor areas that had largely defined FPS up to that point. Trespasser would be a world of lush jungle on a remote island. As the player, you would not simply have a whole bevy of guns that could deal death to dinosaurs at 100 paces and that you could call upon at any time. Indeed, such supplies would be rather scarce. There'd be times when you'd have to conserve ammo, times when you'd have to puzzle your way around packs of dinosaurs in order to not attract their attention. And these dinosaurs wouldn't just be generic enemies who'd run after you. they'd be highly complex creatures with a full range of different emotions, to the point where you'd be fully aware of the makeup of this island, the different tribes that the various dinos belonged to, and so on. This would be a game largely about survival horror even, and even the few interior areas that you'd find wouldn't necessarily be safe. While you'd hardly be able to destroy buildings yourself with the tools on hand, it would be possible for a larger dinosaur to do just that, not to mention the possibility of running into smaller creatures in buildings. And all of this would be tied together with a highly complex and realistic physics engine that would make this world even more immersive, would be a major factor in the aforementioned puzzles and so on. By the standards of the mid-90s, all of this was incredibly ambitious, and that's something that always needs to be stressed when talking about Trespasser. For as much as the game ended up failing in basically all of these areas, the bar that the team set for themselves was very high indeed, as no game had tried to combine all of these things before into a first-person title, especially not a full 3D first-person title like Trespasser was going to be. Every sentence in that last paragraph represents a ton of work, creating a believable jungle environment filled with thousands of trees and rocks and so forth in 3D, dinosaurs that wouldn't just be regular enemies, physics engines that required incredibly complex mathematics from the processor, and putting it all into a package that wasn't going to make consumer-level computers keel over and die. You certainly can't ever accuse the Trespasser developers of laziness. For the 2 and a bit years that this game was under full development, they worked their arses off trying to make this thing. The aim was pretty high. If Trespasser had achieved the targets that the team set for it, then it may well have been the greatest PC game ever made up to that point. But various factors would prevent the game from achieving its lofty goals. Before all that, the game needed a hero, and with the actual characters from the Lost World not in play, the team eventually settled on a female protagonist by the name of Anne, someone who's decided to go on a bit of an adventure for a change, and then so happens to get in a plane crash where she's the only survivor. She lands on Isla Sorna, the home of Site B. She comes to know this because she's read the autobiography of John Parker Hammond, the father of the disaster that was Jurassic Park. Anne is a fit enough woman, although as far as video game heroes go, she is basically a civilian. She doesn't just happen to have a whole load of combat and survival experience under her belt. In short, she isn't Lara Croft, although when the game was released, comparisons were most certainly made. As Seamus Blackley tells the story, the origins of Anne as Trespasser's main character came a little while, maybe only a few weeks or so, before the first Tomb Raider touched down and got people's attention, and naturally there were immediate worries about the game stealing Trespasser's thunder. The dev team soon settled into their roles and this mountain of work. Seamus was the leader of the project and was also handling physics. Surprisingly enough, he didn't really have too many other people to answer to as project leader. The management at DWI largely took a hands-off approach to the game's creation, perhaps because a fair few of them were transplanted from regular DreamWorks, and they didn't know an awful lot about the creation of games or even video games in general. And so for a lot of the time, the Trespasser team would basically be left to their own devices. Spielberg himself would come in on occasion to see what was happening, usually with his kids in tow, and usually he'd be quite encouraged by what he saw and heard, to the point of even sticking a little bit of himself into the game. We'll get to that in due time. Still, it's not like Steven Spielberg is much of an overseer, because, well, he's Steven Spielberg. He's got quite a lot of things on his plate already. To have this amount of creative control is often thought of to be the dream scenario, to not have to deal with the dumb questions or howls of outrage from the suits who want the game to be out, who try to interfere even though they don't have an idea what they're talking about. That's the idea, anyway. In retrospect, the almost total lack of supervision on the project is something that Seamus Blackley and the rest of the team would come to regret. If there had been a bit more control, if they didn't have quite as much freedom, the end product might have ended up more of a success. Let's try and take on this development in detail then, from one part to the next. We'll come across some places where the Trespasser team triumphed in the process, as well as others where the process would be very tough indeed. Indeed, that's most of the areas, to be honest. The environments of Trespasser are the best place to start perhaps. The terrain of Isla Sorna itself is easy enough. They had access to a whole load of material from the books and films, so it wasn't too difficult to essentially create a model of the island's terrain and the geometry to work with. Some people did wonder if Trespasser was going to be so open world as to essentially be one huge level comprising the entirety of Isla Sorna, although if this was part of the plan it was soon scrapped and the game would be a bit more linear. What the designers decided in the end was to use this big model as something they could take parts out of, carving a path through the island that would represent the game's levels. The nitty-gritty of creating the levels themselves was one of the things that proved to be quite the slog. Trespasser was built almost entirely using 3D Max, and whilst it was most certainly a powerful tool, the expansive outdoor environments, dinos and physics, the Photoshop textures and all that, and we'll get into the dinos and physics soon enough, all of this certainly made the program chug and made the creation of the game's world pretty slow. They definitely got as much out of the tool as they could, complete with many an ingenious script that they'd created in order to speed up the process as much as possible, but short of a rather simple little program called GUI app, the team created no bespoke tools or editors to work on the game itself. And there were a lot of times when it could chug along, when just the slightest preview meant a whole load of time spent twiddling thumbs and waiting for said preview of render. This is one of the things that the Trespasser team wish they'd have changed in retrospect, and we'll see what effect it has on development as we get closer to the end. Another thing that made development go slow was, of course, the physics. The massive amount of objects in the game's world, quite possibly more than any other game that had been released to that point, was one thing. In terms of just trees alone, Trespasser covered an awful lot of ground. Some of the touches they came up with were a little ingenious, even if they ended up being flawed in practice. The usage of 2D objects when they were sighted from far away that would then switch to 3D objects as you got closer to them was one particular touch that gave the game a very impressive draw distance. Although in the final release of Trespasser, it also resulted in quite a lot of popping due to how badly the game ran on most systems. But even a big problem like this one was nothing compared to wrestling with all of the physics that they wanted to do. This, and the amount of strain that said physics would put onto the game and onto processors, would be one of the great problems of Trespasser's development. The final result of Trespasser's physics, in the end, is something that basically functions halfway. The physics work well when items are knocked down, but it doesn't work as well when items have to be balanced or stacked on top of each other. It takes a lot less accuracy in the physics for a knockdown to function effectively than it does for stacking to be effective. This is largely down to the penalty force physics method that the game used. In simple terms, this system means that when two items collide, they push away from each other until they no longer touch. When using such a system, it's best to use invisible boxes to build the various models, which will then be encased in various textures. Penalty force is a system that was played with a fair bit in the earlier days of 3D games, but various faults have largely made it obsolete for gaming, and Trespasser demonstrates a lot of these faults. It's quite a challenge to add friction into the mix when using the penalty force method, and friction is most certainly required when you're trying to stack items. Moreover, even the slightest amount of force deployed onto an object stacked onto another will ultimately result in it moving until it cannot do so anymore, until it's completely away from the other object, even if that is at a very slow speed indeed. Coding friction into the physics engine would stop this, of course, but not only is this tough to implement in and of itself, adding friction also chucks in a ton of very serious and very complex maths to the turmoil, which means more work for the processor to do that could compromise everything else. In the final game, this will result in quite a lot of silly things happening that will spoil the game's immersive qualities, and will become another stick to beat the game up with. Right now, this is just one of the problems that Seamus Blackley has to wrestle with. And then of course there's the dinosaurs themselves. Trespasser contains a mixture of carnivores and herbivores. The Tyrannosaurus Rex and Velociraptors are pretty obvious no-brainers, but they're also joined by Brachiosaurs, Stegosaurus, Albertosaurus, Triceratops and Parasaurolophus. There was a hope to include a few others. Compsognathus for one, but they were a bit too small. Gallimimus could have also been there, as part of a stampede perhaps in a soon abandoned plains level, but they were also nixed, as was any idea of including flying enemies like the Pteranodon. Others were left out for accuracy reasons. As much as everyone knows and loves the acid-spitting Dilophosaurus, the team stuck purely to dinos who were present on Isla Sorna, rather than ones who were only on Isla Nublar. There's not a whole lot of unfinished dinos present in the game. The team instead decided to take a fairly small range of dinosaurs and try to do them really well. And part of this was a whole system of emotions, individually tailored not just for every type of dinosaur, but every single dinosaur of that species, individually. The emotions would be fear, love, anger, hunger, curiosity, thirst, fatigue, pain and solidity, and they would determine a wide range of dino behaviours. It wasn't automatically a given. For example, that a raptor would straight up attempt to kill you at first sight. Maybe they'll just sniff you. Maybe they'll even leave you alone if you don't attack them, and maybe an attack could ward them off without killing them instead of inspiring them to fight to the death. If they're left to their own devices, perhaps they'll try and get a drink of water, or they'll fight other species. If they see you, maybe they'll go straight for you, or they'll roar out and call for help from other members of their tribe. The raptors in particular, always destined to be the most plentiful dino on the island, would be split into 3 separate and very different tribes. This is the theory, of course. Successfully implementing this highly complex AI was another matter entirely, and just another big challenge facing the team. Not all parts of creating the game was such a huge slog. It's important to point out the areas where the game utterly triumphed, and the biggest area of them all is in sound. This wasn't just a simple matter of taking sounds from the films and chucking them in the game. The iconic Jurassic Park sounds and the John Williams scores and so on were not, in fact, the property of DreamWorks, and the team had no access to them. They turned instead to other sources to provide the game's sound. A highly talented composer by the name of Bill Brown was quite simply asked if he could provide some suitably Williams-esque music for the game, and he duly obliged with a brilliant job with the game's luscious and dynamic soundtrack. The unsung heroes of the game are a little outfit by the name of Sound Deluxe Media Labs, who provided the sound effects for the game. They didn't just do a great job when it came to creating croaks and roars for the dinosaurs and ambience for the various levels, but the weapons in Trespasser generally sound phenomenal. There's a randomised element to the sounds of the guns in the game which really adds to the authenticity and the feeling of them. And when you put all of these different things together, you end up with an utterly terrific sounding game indeed. It's one of the few parts of Trespasser that can be called an unqualified success, and there was still one other element of it to be added.
7. 4.
The story of Trespasser is a pretty simple one. Woman crashes on island filled with dinosaurs and has to escape. But the team, and specifically Austin Grossman, in charge of this narrative, do a good job of adding a lot more to that and making their own contribution to Jurassic Park's general lore, even if you only have 2 voices in the game, that of Anne and of John Parker Hammond, as remembered by Anne from his autobiography. And they spared no expense here. The popular British actress Minnie Driver was recruited to play Anne, and she did a fine job indeed with the character. But the real gem of the game, and a massive coup really, was having Lord Richard Attenborough himself reprise his role as John Hammond. They had all of 1 day with Dickie to get his performance. He was utterly courteous and professional throughout, and he delivers magnificently, adding a whole lot to the character. Trespasser is written remarkably well for a licensed product, the acting is brilliant, and so is the environmental storytelling. There's sequences in the finished game that are utterly filled with wonder, and we'll get to them when we look at the game properly.
What if a mosquito sucked the blood of a dinosaur 100 million years ago? The insect is then covered in tree sap, which, over the millennia, becomes amber.
So hopefully this all does justice to the sheer amount of work that Trespasser's dev team had to do, and they most certainly were giving it a damn good go. While there were things that could have been improved in retrospect, Trespasser was not a thoroughly chaotic and disorganised production. It doesn't have the elements of, say, a Duke Nukem Forever or something like that. The game promised a lot, but the people behind the game actually meant to fulfil those promises. The previews of the game were encouraging, as was the feedback from people at DreamWorks, including of course big man Steven Spielberg himself. As we roll into 1998, there's still plenty of work to be done, but it is happening. However, unbeknownst to the team, time itself was about to turn its head, flare up, and spit a ball of acid in their face. After nearly 2 years in development, Trespasser is suddenly going to have to be dragged kicking and screaming to the finish line, regardless of the state that the game's in. In a recent feature for Retro Gamer, Seamus Blackley relived the moment when the development of Trespasser transformed from something that was tough and long but going okay, into something that was a complete nightmare. For most of the game's development, the management hadn't really been present, and not a great deal of thought had been given to a release date. As far as the team was concerned, Trespasser was going to take as long as was needed. How long's a piece of string? But then, one day, management says to Seamus that they've just signed a deal with AMD, and a part of that deal is a set release date for Trespasser, October 1998. No matter what the game is at that point, that's when it's going out. If it's not in a releasable state, there will be no more funding for the project. With 6 months to go until that date, the game was still a long way from finished. Seamus estimated that it would have needed 6 to 9 months beyond October 1998 in order to get the game there. But that was time they no longer had. Overnight, the development changed from the creation of something that they hoped would be the most impressive game ever released, into bashing everything they had together and trying to get the game into a state that was halfway playable. Just about everything suffered majorly as a result. A lot of the levels were still pretty far from finished, and they had been tricky to create in ordinary times. Now the slow development of the levels was a serious problem indeed. A lot of material had to be cut. Elements from levels such as the plantation house had to be tacked onto other more completed levels, 2 levels combined into one basically, or in the case of the most famous missing level, Pine Valley, they had to be excised completely, although Pine Valley would form the basis for the game's demo. Really, the greatest casualty of all was the game's final third, featuring Anne's climb to the summit of Mount Watson and to escape. Not much work at all had been done on this last part of the game, and as such these levels contain almost nothing when compared to other levels like the town or the jungle road, essentially being little but a straight line filled with raptors. Speaking of dinosaurs, the team had only just started implementing them into levels when the crunch began, meaning that again there was a whole lot of compromise on this front. Forget about a T-Rex ripping off the roof of a building. Dinosaurs wouldn't be included in any of the buildings, as doing so simply caused too many major clipping bugs and there wasn't enough time to fix them. And that was just half of it when it came to dinosaurs. The complex system of emotions that the dinosaurs were supposed to have, it just didn't happen in the end. They tried their best, but when a dinosaur was placed into the world with all of these emotions, they basically didn't know what to do. With all this range of emotions and the actions that could result from these emotions, the dinosaurs chose to do absolutely nothing, unable to decide on a course of action. Again, the only way to solve this problem was with a crude fix. Turn every single emotion on the aggressive dinosaurs, the raptors, Albertosaurus and T-Rex, except for anger and hunger down to 0, and max out those two. In doing this, the dinosaurs stopped being complex creatures and essentially became more straightforward enemies that by and large would attack Anne on sight and then chase her to the ends of the earth unless distracted by another dinosaur. In other words, exactly the sort of thing that the team had wanted to avoid. Raptors weren't even able to do jump attacks. It was too risky, and due to the physics engine, jump attacks could result in dinosaurs fusing together with each other. In the end, all they're able to do is charge with their mouth open, attempting to hit Anne with the invisible rectangular hitbox inside their mouth. The dinosaurs were at the very least able to take different amounts of damage based on where they were shot and bleed accordingly, but that was about it. And all that's still far from the worst casualty. That would be the physics, and something we've barely got into but would become the game's most visible flaw, the way Latan interacted with the world. Naturally, the physics were not all they could have been. The penalty force system had its own intrinsic flaws, and there was no time to code friction. The puzzles that the team hoped to create with these physics would be greatly limited as a result, essentially mostly becoming throwing an object to knock down another object. Indeed, the inclusion of mass for most objects in the game caused a whole load of problems, particularly when it came to melee weapons. If a melee weapon had any mass at all, it would likely damage Anne as she moved, if she had it on her person. Once again, there's no time for anything but a crude solution. Turn the mass down to 0 for just about every potential melee weapon, essentially rendering them useless. Only a couple of melee weapons have any potential use: a skull, Dennis Nedry's mace, and weirdly a Quake logo that's not ordinarily accessible in-game, hidden under the ground as an Easter egg. I suppose you could say the cattle prod as well, but again, if you use it, it damages you while you're moving. On top of all that, the collision detection was seriously off, with boxes clipping into each other often, and a lot of objects not even properly placed on the ground. Dinosaurs, when attacking, often twist themselves into unnatural shapes as they walk and attempt to attack Anne, destroying any hope that the game had of being an immersive experience. And speaking of twisting into unnatural shapes, the original aim, of course, had been for Anne to be a fully featured 3D model. She would interact with the world of Trespasser using both of her arms, and these arms could be manipulated by the player so that puzzles could be solved and weapons could be freely aimed and fired at dinosaurs. The game would also feature a HUD-less interface, and Anne's health would have been represented by a tattoo of a heart on her left arm that filled up as Anne took damage, although health quickly regenerates in-game. However, ultimately the inclusion of a second arm would prove impossible. It just didn't work at all with the game's physics and simply caused yet more problems. In the end, Anne only has one arm, with the storyline reason being that she broke her left arm when the plane crashed, but the right arm that's still there usually moves about in thoroughly unnatural ways indeed, twisting about ridiculously almost every time Anne picks up an object, and barely capable of holding on to said objects. Usually if they touch anything, they'll be sent flying. The best you can hope for then is that it lands safely, while at worst they'll tear a hole through the world and the game will crash. Anne's noodle arm would be the main cudgel that critics would beat the game with due to how ridiculous it looked, closely followed by the new way that Anne checked her health, by constantly looking down at her rather large chest to see the heart tattoo. The big breasts may have been rather stupid looking in first person, especially when they're actually the thing you see the most of in game, but they also serve to hide Anne having no feet at all, or legs. Indeed, if you use a code to look at Anne in third person, all you'll see is a single arm, a chest, and a cube that she moves around with. For the Trespasser dev team, who had devoted most of their time in trying to actually make not just a good, but a great game, this final crunch was about as horrible and unrewarding as they come. They basically knew that really they had no time left to make the game what it could have been, and that the promises they'd made would not be fulfilled. Hell, if they were able to get the game in a state where it could run on the majority of graphics card-led systems of the time, they'd have been really lucky. And in the end, even that could hardly be achieved. With all the physics going on, the nature of the graphics and the serious processing power required, most consumer systems were barely able to run the finished title at anything approaching an acceptable frame rate. The game didn't play at all nice with popular 3D cards like the Voodoo 2 and what have you. Basically, in the time that Trespasser was developed, there was the massive boom in 3D graphics card with all sorts of brands available, all very different from each other, and Trespasser, come the end of its development, did not really have time to be compatible with all of that. So the final product was incredibly unstable, with fatal errors and crashes aplenty. Even the slightest unexpected event could result in complete failure. Some of the more critical errors were resolved with a 1.1 patch that was released a few weeks after the game's arrival on shelves, but by then the damage was well and truly done. When Trespasser hit the shelves, it was immediately savaged beyond belief. After all the promise of the game's previews, this was the final product? And needless to say, the market and the critics were hardly going to pay attention to any mitigating circumstances. This game was, after all, an unfinished disaster, simple as that. What we've largely seen in this part is how the game looked to most of the people who played it in 1998. A buggy mess that, if you ran it at an acceptable resolution, would move along a total of a few frames per second, 5 at best. To get even close to the game's 20 FPS cap, you'd likely have to turn the game all the way down to 320 by 240, with the result being seriously ugly, filled with artifacts and divoted to hell and back. We will see the game looking closer to the developer's vision soon, but in 1998 this was Trespasser's unfortunate reality. Eventually the game only shipped about 50,000 copies, making it one of the least successful games in the entire Jurassic Park franchise, and a huge commercial flop considering the time and millions of dollars that were spent on its creation. By the time the year-end awards rolled around, Trespasser was very much in consideration for the raspberries. Several publications gave it Worst Game of the Year honours, or Most Disappointing, or Coastal of the Year in one example. Just another final kick-in before the entire botched title was forgotten about completely, really. The innovations and advances that Trespasser had hoped to bring to the table were quickly divvied up amongst other FPSs of the time. Unreal's outdoor environments may not have quite been as advanced as Trespasser's, but the game was a hell of a lot more playable. Half-Life came out in November of 1998, the very next month, and immediately set a new standard for immersion and in-game storytelling, the standard that Trespasser had hoped to achieve and had fallen so far short of. In the wake of such games, Trespasser became, for most people, little more than a filthy memory. For the people who had created the game, this was all a complete tragedy indeed, at best something they'd not exactly be highlighting in their CVs, and at worst a potential industry career killer. But both in the short term and the long term, not just for these people but for Trespasser itself, things wouldn't quite work out this way. In the end, the failure of Trespasser wouldn't do a great deal of harm to the people who made it. If anything, it was quite the opposite. A lot of the people behind the game would go on to, and indeed still have, excellent careers in the industry. Most of them would shift over to EA when they bought out DWI in 2000 and work on a new game, that being the cult classic Clive Barker's Undying. Austin Grossman would find his eventual calling as a novelist, and Bill Brown would score many more games, films and TV shows. But the biggest success of all would be the man behind the project, and the one who most certainly thought at first that the failure of Trespasser would be the death knell for his career in games. Seamus Blackley had and continues to have an awful lot of regrets when it comes to Trespasser. He wished that he'd have had more hands-on people above him to curb some of his wilder flights of fantasy. He wished that he'd have turned over the physics side of the game to other people so that he could fully concentrate on managing the project instead of being young and stupid and thinking that he could do it all. And he wished that he'd battered harder to get more time on the project. As he's quite fond of saying, a game is only late until it's released, but an unfinished game is unfinished forever. The 27-year-old Blackley thought that failing to deliver on Trespasser would result in him being bounced out of the industry, dismissed as just another hack who got too big for his boots, flew too close to the sun, and got burnt. However, it turned out that a few important people had taken notice of the work done on Trespasser, and they were able to see through those flaws and find the potential within. Just what this project could have been, and the fact that the game was clearly created by an incredibly talented set of people. One of those people, who had been very impressed by the previews for Trespasser, was a certain Mr. William Henry Gates III. Early in 1999, old Bill tapped Blackley up, and he took on a position at Microsoft as the program manager for entertainment graphics. DirectX in so many words. When faced with competition from the PS2, Microsoft wondered how they could take Sony on, and it was Blackley who came up with and championed the idea of Microsoft creating their own console platform in order to compete with the PlayStation 2 more directly. This was an approach that dealt with the problem of PCs not having a standardised build or anything like that. It was something Microsoft could certainly achieve with their hefty technological resources, and Bill Gates soon came around to the proposal. This paved the way for Seamus's greatest contribution to games. He would set the ball rolling on the original Xbox, putting together the team that would build it, and then selling it to publishers and developers around the world. His work would certainly help Microsoft's machines stick the landing, and the Xbox would be established as the PS2's main competitor, particularly in the West. In doing this, he largely moved more towards management as opposed to coding and designing, but his pivotal role in the Xbox would cement his place as an industry legend. That said, this elevated status in the industry has never stopped him from fielding questions and talking about the game he previously failed on. There's always been interest in Trespasser ever since its disastrous release in 1998, and while we'll soon be getting to the game's fans who have helped preserve the title, a lot of interest came from fellow game developers who had used Trespasser as a jumping off point. Trespasser isn't often talked about as an influential game due to its failure, but really it should be. People would probably be quite surprised at how many titles the game directly influenced, even in failure. A lot of people saw what Trespasser tried to achieve, and well, you could say that they decided that they wanted to do it right. As much as Unreal was the big game in terms of popularity that really pushed expansive outdoor environments as being an important part of FPSs, Trespasser had its place there too. And in the early 2000s, a lot of FPSs started appearing which made use of heavy outdoor environments. Going back to the Xbox, the console's killer app Halo Combat Evolved was most certainly one of them, and Seamus Blackley definitely thinks that there's a fair bit of Trespasser's DNA lurking around in the adventures of Master Chief. But for a more direct influence, look no further than the initial breakthrough of German developers Crytek, who made waves at E3 in 1999 with their Exile benchmark program for their 3D engine, initially set on an island filled with dinosaurs. Comparisons to Trespasser were immediate and most certainly warranted, and while the dinosaurs eventually didn't make it to the first proper game that used Crytek's engine, the jungle environments and vast open world most certainly did. I hardly need to say that the engine would be more famously known as the CryEngine, and that the game in question is 2004's Far Cry, a monumental PC release indeed. More established industry figures than Crytek took note of Trespasser's exploits too. John Carmack cited the game as an influence on Doom 3, pushing the game towards telling its story through audio logs rather than cutscenes. Again, this was something that System Shock 2 triumphed at more than any other game at the time, but Trespasser had its own part to play. Still, Trespasser's enduring legacy would be in its usage of physics. Even if it didn't exactly get it right and was mocked brutally for it, some people definitely saw that serious physics would have a big part to play in the creation of not just FPSs, but all sorts of games. One of those people was Gabe Newell, and the inclusion of physics in Trespasser was one of the things that spurred Valve to basically go all in on physics for Half-Life 2. At some points they worried that such an emphasis on physics would immediately draw jokey comparisons to Trespasser, but with Half-Life 2 they were determined to get it right. In doing so, they certainly showed that the Trespasser's team's ideas were pretty strong indeed. Half-Life 2 and the whole host of games that followed in its wake, throwing physics around absolutely everywhere, certainly bore that out. This is just a little sampling of the influence that the game had on various industry people, and because of this the game certainly has a place in gaming history, despite being such a critical and commercial failure. In the ensuing years, the initial vitriol people had towards Trespasser turned more towards being respectful of a game that was very ambitious. In many ways it was years ahead of its time, but various factors prevented it from achieving what it set out to do. It still managed to drive games forward and show a future for FPS that the genre would eventually commit to, even if it didn't make the grade itself. Trespasser most certainly had its place. Still, for the more dedicated fans of the game, that's not quite enough. Trespasser should be celebrated even more, and a part of doing that is ensuring that the game's not only always around to be played on modern systems, but that mods show just what potential the engine had, and that there are now ways to play the game that come a great deal closer to what the developer team had envisioned. Here in 2021, the days of gratuitous pop-in and pixel artifacts are over, and a group of dedicated fans can be thanked for that. For as long as Trespasser has existed, people have wanted to get inside of the game, to see how it worked, and to make mods of it, just as they would any other big FPS. All these people by and large were fans of the game, of course, but Trespasser was hardly a game that could be modded easily, like others on the market. Indeed, trying to do any sort of modding of this piece of software had such a tough time of functioning normally was a massive order indeed, a huge challenge. But in the months following the game's release, a small group called the Trespasser Hacking Society appeared with the intention to do just that. In a very useful post-mortem for Trespasser from May 1999's Game Developer magazine, the coder Richard Wyckoff wondered how such a thing could even be possible, that it was a lunatic task to try to figure out how to do a mod for an engine which was barely usable with its in-house tools. Such things only increased these dedicated people's motivation. Why try? Well, because they loved the game for one, despite its flaws, and because it's there, as the old Edmund Hillary quote goes. The initial efforts of the THS took, as you might expect, quite some time, years even. The efforts bore little fruit, and if they weren't wholly ignored, they were mocked for doing such a thing. So the first THS broke up quickly, but they would calcify again under a new group and site called Trespasser Secrets, and this group of people stuck at it. When this group also lost steam after a couple of years, the process began anew, this time in the community which still proudly flies the flag for Trespasser today, and without whom this video would not be possible for various reasons. Trescom. But it's not like the first efforts at hacking Trespasser didn't get anywhere. Trescom is full of accounts of and artifacts from these attempts, of the completely unsung heroes who sought to take this dumped and excoriated game and do something entirely new with it. Of a man named Charles Hughes, or T.S. Ord, who set up the website Trespasser Secrets, made the first initial tools for editing files for the game, and is largely credited with really getting the ball rolling on modding for Trespasser. Sadly, Charles passed away in a car accident in October 2001, killed by a speeding driver as he tried to help a victim of a hit and run. Being that this was the early days of the World Wide Web, no one found out until years later. One day someone just stops posting on a page completely, it's abandoned without explanation, and finally the domain expires and the entire work disappears, with only whatever a Wayback Machine managed to scrape from its life remaining. That's just what happens on the internet after all. It's not uncommon, and usually the reasons are perfectly innocent ones. Mostly someone just gets bored of it. But sometimes, as in the case of Charles, there are other more tragic reasons. Still, the original work of T.S. Ord would be the foundation for so much that came after. Another coder, named Andres James, created the first version of TresView in 2000, which allowed people to view the levels freely. And with this in play, would it now be possible to actually edit these levels? In short, yes it would. In April of 2002, TresView became TresEd, and it would soon be followed by a tool called GeomAdd, which allowed new geometry to be added to the levels. To use a well-worn quote from the game, this was where the real magic trick happened. After a good couple of years of work done purely out of love for the title, modding the game was now possible. Modding for Trespasser may not be as popular as, say, modding for Half-Life, but they didn't care, and quite a bit of blood and sweat had gone into getting this far. In the years hence, although the community is small and updates are sparse, much has been achieved using Trespasser. There's plenty of levels filled with new areas, buildings, dinosaurs, everything right up to total conversions. They're a dedicated bunch, and Trescom remains up to date to host all of it. They've also explored every inch of the original game, uncovered whole masses of detail, found artifacts that were thought to be lost, done their best to recreate missing levels like the Pine Valley. And they also play host to ways of playing the original game that are, objectively, a great deal better than how it ran on PCs back in 1998. Tools and hacks now exist which allow Trespasser to play nicely with more modern systems, the first one being the exceptional ATX tool. This was the standard for years, and using ATX it was possible to play Trespasser in a much more stable fashion. Not perfectly stable, but now it would run in full resolutions at a much better speed. The mod that I've used for this video, CE, is even better. With Trespasser CE, the 20 FPS cap is removed, and the game can take advantage of even more modern conveniences. What does this mean in practice? Well, here's the first shot of Trespasser as it looked in the original, running on a PCM emulator, Windows 98, in 320x240, and now 640x480. And here's the same shot, only in CE. 1080p resolution, 60 frames per second. And stable too. It's still Trespasser, of course, but in the time I spent capturing the whole game on CE, it only crashed to desktop once. This fact alone would leave those who broke their back trying to play the game in 1998 utterly green with envy. The work on these mods has pretty much universally been acclaimed by those who worked on the game. A lot of them have been interviewed for the Trescom site to share their experiences on the original. It certainly meant a lot for Seamus Blackley, Austin Grossman and others to see the work that a lot of modders have done and what they'd been able to create. And it's just another thing that's gradually helped Trespasser to come around over the years, from a dreadful failure to a very curious title, one that's really worth examining in detail. And finally, now, I think it's time we did that. To not just look at Trespasser purely from a technical perspective and go for its many failings in that front, as is often the case, but to look at it as a game. Trespasser CE may not strictly be the original game, but it is a hell of a lot closer to what was intended than the unfinished game that was released in 1998. If nothing else, think of it as a second look. Maybe more accurately, a second chance. Now, it should be stressed again that beyond allowing the game to run largely properly on modern systems, Trespasser CE does not change anything intrinsic about the game. It's still the exact same textures, same dinos, same physics, same gameplay. It's Trespasser as it was in 1998, just a hell of a lot easier to run. It allows us to have a look at the game properly without running into endless crashes and without the game chugging along at a snail's pace. And in doing so, there's a lot of gems to be found in Trespasser. It's not a great game, of course. Indeed, it would be really stretching it to call Trespasser a good game, as it's got plenty of flaws. But it's a game that breeds curiosity, the sort of thing that once you've played it, doesn't really leave your mind. It is quite amusing how the first level, the beach, lays just about all the cards on the table immediately. It functions as a tutorial area and general playground, and what you see here is mostly what you'll see for the rest of the game. You'll learn about the physics, how to use the noodle arm, the jumping and so on. Eventually, as is JP tradition, your first sighting of the dinosaurs will be majestic brachiosaurs stomping around in the distance, and shortly after you'll have your first encounters with a couple of raptors. It's a carefully constructed microcosm of the entire game, replete with crates to knock down, or chairs that have been carefully put together to explode into pieces as soon as they're touched. The rest of Trespasser's levels are something of a mixed bag, but as you might have figured, the game's a hell of a lot stronger in its first half than it is at the end. Here the game's ideas of having very open levels that allow a fair bit of exploration are strong. The second level has lots of little secret areas that are worth going out of your way to find. There's the plantation house, which at one stage was supposed to be its own level but then got merged with this one. There's the jeep filled with the remains of hunters who never had a hope in hell against Site B's rampant dinosaurs. And there's the spooky beach, a direct reference to the intro of the Lost World movie, complete with "Daddy, you've gotta come see this" sample. All of this and more is accompanied by sound bites from both Anne and from John Hammond. There's plenty of them, although they're not constant and usually they're appropriately timed. There's a good balance between this narration of your journey and the ambience of the island.
November 1983. Test fertilization of an artificial ovum. My hand shook as I held the tiny eyedropper. 1 drop. 2 drops. There. The genie was out of the bottle.
The funny thing was how easy it was. Nobody stops you. Just Get on the bus and watch the highway start moving. The whole world before you. I guess it's not a vacation if you don't know when you're coming back.
Again, sound is one of the areas of Trespasser where the game really succeeds. At the game's best, it truly has an incredible atmosphere, the sort that can seem thoroughly enticing, especially when you see the game in a video. To take a little sidetrack to a classic video series, my initial curiosity about Trespasser was piqued by the Let's Play series Research Indicates did for the game on the Something Awful forums back in the early 2010s. As much as he discussed the flaws of the game in his incredibly calm and appropriate voice, the game itself was what grabbed your attention immediately.
One.
Your fight is over. It's back under the breach for me. Rest well, friend. We'll meet again soon enough. It's kind of a shame when friendly dinosaurs get killed in this game. They distract your enemies, take hits for you, and will sometimes kill a thing that's trying to kill you. They're really your only buddies on this island.
Now, it does have to be said that there are plenty of things about the game that can spoil the atmos, especially whenever Anne gets the old noodle arm out. Yes, it is clearly a very silly thing, something you just have to get used to if you play the game for any length of time. Yes, you can use the noodle arm to actually shoot yourself. Hell, if you speedrun this game, you can use it and endlessly jumping on an object that you've grabbed to literally fly around the levels. It's not too bad in combat against the raptors for the most part, as long as you stick to middle-on range. Trespasser has a fairly extensive range of guns, and even if you don't have a crosshair, it's not long before you get used to the free aim and are able to get decent shots on enemies. It is a bit silly, of course. Anne is able to fire high-caliber pistols, Kalashnikovs, and even combat shotguns with only one arm, and she audibly counts down the amount of bullets she has left with every shot, which is kind of an awkward solution to not having a HUD display to show the amount of ammo you have. Again, these are things you just kind of get used to when playing the game. Seeing as you largely don't want to be up close and personal with the raptors, even with weapons like the Desert Eagle and Bell shotgun, you do at least tend to adopt a wary playing style when playing the game, always on the lookout for the creatures lurking in the distance and trying to make the most out of every shot. Running through the game isn't really a good idea, as you'll probably end up with tons of dinos on your back, and you most certainly don't want to get the old clever girl treatment. That said, it sure can be a shock when a raptor does appear out of nowhere, as they are wont to do, and if they do get the drop on you, well, they can kill you pretty quickly. As silly as the combat might look at times, it does encourage a playstyle that's very appropriate for the game and what the developers wanted you to do. Of course, not every dinosaur warrants straight-ahead combat. Other dinosaurs like the Stegosaur, Triceratops and Parasaurolophus, as well as other carnivores like the Albertosaurus and T-Rex, can distract the raptors. This is pretty useful, and it also gives you the opportunity to watch the dinosaurs fight with each other, which can be, rather amusing. The Albertosaurus is pretty killable, although it takes a lot of ammo to do so, and usually isn't worth it, and the T-Rex, well, you're best off running. It is possible to kill one late in the game, but only if you take the most powerful weapon of them all, the toxic rifle, all the way from the start to the end of a level, and then get 3 headshots on T-Rex. Easier said than done, to be honest with you. The T-Rex doesn't chase you to the ends of the map, at least in the way that raptors do. They can't run forever and they get distracted easily. Still, their size and the roar of music that usually accompanies their appearances do make for some of the game's most intense moments. We've already talked about how good the music is, but it's never not welcome when it comes in. It is suitably John Williams-esque, and it soundtracks both these intense action moments and some of the more solemn moments of the game when you really get to explore this abandoned site. Such as the town, for example.
Maybe if there's a phone line or a radio.
Level 4 of the game, the town, is easily Trespasser's greatest triumph. It's a massive playground of a level filled with things to explore and things to learn about the story of Site B. More than any other level, this work-in-progress settlement of burrows, named after Edgar Rice Burroughs, for the workers conveys both the promise of the entire Jurassic Park project and the incredibly sudden way in which the whole thing was abandoned after the incident on Isla Nublar. People just put everything down and got out of there, leaving it to the dinosaurs. There aren't actually many dinos in this level, although this sparseness allows you to examine the town, grab the various keycards you're going to need here, and find out just what happened. From the shattered visitors centre, to the mod cons of Henry Roo's digs, and the Georgian grandiosity of Hammond's mansion. It's also filled with sound bites, which gives us plenty more chances to admire old Dickie Attenborough's wonderful performance. It could be argued that the best reason of all to play Trespasser is to experience a master actor at work. Richard Attenborough didn't half-ass this job. To be fair, Minnie Driver didn't either, and Trespasser probably represents some of the best voice acting ever done in games up to that point, still something I would argue as being right up there. But Attenborough in particular is a tour de force, an unqualified genius of his craft, giving more life to this curious character of John Parker Hammond than ever. One of the many secrets of the town, a diskette that features a monologue from Hammond recounting a tragic event from his youth, is genuinely upsetting.
There on her upper lip, the way she exhaled the smoke from her cigarette. I stammered it. I was not certain what I should say. She laughed, though, and seemed charmed. She asked me to call again tomorrow. At 2 a.m. I called once again. She had still not come home, nor did they know where she was. I didn't leave my name. I'll never forget this, and I will never forgive. I swear it. This is the last time.
Another sequence that might well trigger emotions is the best of all in the game, on the very next level, the lab. Not quite as filled with secrets as the town, but Dennis Nedry's domain does contain the utter wonder that is the Cray supercomputer sequence. This is a beautiful moment, once again filled with utterly captivating words from Hammond as you gradually start the computer for yourself and relive the wonder of taking that incredibly fanciful idea, extracting the DNA of a dinosaur from an insect preserved in amber and cloning it, and making it a reality. This is the entire concept of Jurassic Park, the sheer beauty of it beyond it just being a blockbuster action movie or best-selling book and what have you, at its very best.
And then it opened up. The code read true. The barrier of time for an instant opened. Nedry and I stared into the monitor. Straight back through 65,000 centuries.
As an example of environmental storytelling, the game at its best is an absolute wonder, and for most of the first half, despite all the faults that the game may have, it is a game filled with atmosphere and character, with many curiosities hidden all over the island, from the smuggler's plane to the skeletons inside the dam. And of course, we can't forget Steven Spielberg's little addition to the game, a puzzle that he created. It may not be that different from various other puzzles, you're shooting something in order to knock it down, but it is a jeep knocked down from a very great height onto a raptor that so happens to be standing idle, and that's hardly an unsatisfying thing to do. Naturally, the rock containing Spielberg's secret message decided that it was going to fly off to some inaccessible location when I captured the game, but here it is in screenshot form. There's enough good stuff in about half of Trespasser for a lot of the flaws in the physics, or jumping around and getting stuck, or even the various other technical issues like the clipping or the objects suspended in the air to be ignored. Whether it's a beautiful waterfall, a half-finished monorail, or any of the island's lost treasures that I've mentioned. It's not all pretty. The game does have a strange attraction towards stretched textures in parts, which is not nice to look at, but there's way more good than bad. Alas, this doesn't last till the end. Trespasser's biggest problems lie in its final third. This is of course the part of the game that had to be rushed in the crunch period of development in order to give the game any ending at all, and short of a few Mayan ruins here and there, the last 3 levels of Trespasser, the 2-part Ascent and the Summit, feature very little to shout about. For the most part, they're straight lines chock full of powerful raptors and not a whole lot of ammunition. There's nothing around to explore or anything like that. Either that or there's a whole load of switchbacks taking you up Mount Watson, something that you always faintly see in the background through most of the game, bidding you onwards to the equally faint hope of escape, and that is a pretty good touch to basically always have it there. But when you get there, it's little more than a large mass of stretched grey textures, and when you're going up, you're probably also going to be fighting a lot against the geometry, trying not to get stuck on terrain. What puzzles are here aren't anything you haven't seen before. As has been mentioned, the awkward physics kind of limited what could be done on that front, so there's not much here that you didn't already do in the very first areas of the game even. In short, the last 3 levels contain little except the game's worst aspects. It's a shame really, but this is Trespasser's development in action, the evidence of what went wrong. Finally, when you reach the summit of Mount Watson, you end up with a final boss fight of sorts. And yes, it's a disappointment. Yes, it is just a slightly bigger velociraptor. Obviously this wasn't the plan all along, this is just what had to be done in order to finish the game, but it is a pain considering that the 3 tribes of raptors are basically the only enemies you fight, unless you really go out of your way to take on a rarer Albertosaurus or T-Rex. You feel like you've gone on a journey of sorts, and there is a satisfaction when you finally reach that helipad, but it's kind of a strange mixture of thinking back to the game's better moments and being thankful that the terrible final part of the game is done with. Trespasser does become a dreadful slog for those final 3 levels, and there's not much that can be done to fix that. It is a rather curious coincidence really. A game that's all about this site on a remote island that was suddenly abandoned has a feeling in the end like it was itself abandoned, with the final parts barely worked on. That wasn't the case as such. The team simply had to put something here and they had no time to do what they actually wanted to do. But it does make for a bittersweet conclusion to the roller coaster experience that is Trespasser. But wait, there is one final flourish. A cheat to bring up the wireframe mode reveals an invisible path at the start of the summit, and following that invisible path leads to a secret ending, the last thing that the team were able to record with Richard Attenborough, a reading of Percy Shelley's classic poem Ozymandias. And not just for this video, but for this game that somehow has managed to stand the test of time, there could scarcely be a more appropriate epilogue.
I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed." And on the pedestal these words appear: "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away."